Everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Fact Day 4. Thank you all so much for joining us for this morning session. My name is Alice Xiong, and I'm one of your Fact General Chairs this year, and it's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker today. André Brock is Associate Professor of Media Studies at Georgia Tech. He writes on Western technoculture and Black cybercultures, and his scholarship examines race in social media, video games, blogs, and other digital media. His book, Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures, is the 2021 winner of the Harry Shaw and Katrina Hazard Donald Award for Outstanding Work in African American Popular Culture Studies, and the 2021 Nancy Bayham Book Award, and it theorizes Black everyday lives mediated by network technologies. And today, André will be speaking on weak tie algorithmic sociality and digital culture. So please join me in welcoming André. Let's see. And
good morning. I can't do my usual call and response tricks, in part because we're virtual, but also because y'all are up at 8 o'clock in the morning. So thank you very much for joining me at this ungodly hour. And special thanks to Seth Lazar and Charles Isbell, who invited me to do this fantastic event. And I don't wish I could be there with you. That sounds like a long ass flight. In any case, let's jump to the presentation. So today's talk pulls from some concepts I began to consider in Distributed Blackness, my first book with New York University Press. My goal with this book was to unpack what Black technology use or Black technoculture would look like from the perspective of Black folk without resorting to deficit models, commodification concerns, or Black mythology. Because I theorize racial identity as a dialectic between two groups, an in-group and an out-group, my work, by necessity, also inquires into whiteness, or how the West provides a context for Blackness. So this approach starts from theorizing whiteness as technoculture and as information design. Today's presentation will walk through some of that, and specifically the ways that algorithm as white interpretive flexibility can manifest racism on social media. And I found out, I came across this finding, which was kind of surprising to me, although it shouldn't have been, right? Through my investigation of the harms that algorithms inflict upon Black digital practitioners. Like Sophia Noble, Ruha Benjamin, and Timnit Gebru, I argue that the computer is an agent and practitioner of racialized activity. But my approach differs radically in some aspects. And so hopefully today's presentation will illuminate how a humanistic approach can illuminate the workings of algorithmic culture. So I used to just jump straight into the theory and confuse the out of people, but I've now decided to be more merciful, and I offer my audiences a spoiler slide to let y'all know where I'm headed. As a rhetorician, I usually begin with the theories that power my inquiry, but sometimes you got to give the folk a taste of the product so that you can get them hooked. So this is my money shot. Today, I want to discuss how social media algorithms, tightly knit networks of Black online sociality, and the internet's effortless capacity and desire to distribute sensational content lead to the authorless reproduction of racist microaggressions on Black social media feeds, or racism without racists. I call this phenomenon weak tie racism. My research begins from critical discourse analysis with a focus on technology and belief. And if you're sleepy, you can read more about it in my article, Critical Technocultural Discourse Analysis, which has turned out to be the worst acronym ever for a method. This method draws upon the philosopher of science Arnold Pacey's conception of technology as having multiple aspects. Pacey argues that all technologies have three qualities: technical, organizational, and cultural. And in my own work, I use the terms instead artifact or what, practice or how, and belief to dial into the specific qualities of the technology, usually computational, that I plan to analyze. this construct is important to me because Pacey argues, and those of you who read Wired or Ars Technica or ACM, uh, uh, he argues that technologies are most often described, analyzed, and understood based on the first two qualities, that is, what they are and how they work, which leaves culture or beliefs to implicitly yet powerfully shape our expectations of how those technologies will alter the world and, in the process, ourselves. And these beliefs are intangible, even as they help us to make sense of who we are when we use technology. So this three-piece and a biscuit, this triple-headed dragon, I'm asking you to consider as the concept of technoculture, right, to describe this dance. And it's meant to illustrate the material, instrumental, and ideological perceptions of technologies, but with a focus on the power of belief in determining what it is we're doing and what it is we're seeing. So there we go. This is a participatory thing. I'm going to ask my moderator to keep track of the hands. I would like to know how many of you in the audience have an Android phone? Moderator, how many hands do we have? Moderator, you got to help me, work with me. All right, so I'll pretend like I can see them. And how many of you have Apple phones? I'll pretend like I can see them.
Okay, yeah, we can say we have a lot more Apple phones than Androids.
So Android users, briefly describe the type of person an Apple product user is. You know, that never
Does anyone want
fails.
to go to one of the mics?
You can repeat their answers if they don't want to make it up to the mic.
Any brave volunteers?
Don't be scared.
Hearing a lot of sheep. We're hearing a lot of sheep.
Okay, so people who ascribe to fashion over innovation, fair, right? People who have a lot of money. My students are much more savage than you guys are. I don't know why you're being so polite when most of y'all are hungover anyway, right? So they describe Apple users as those interested only in convenience, as if all Android users know how to root their phones and install alternate kernels, right? But what I argue is that if you held an Android phone face forward and an Apple phone face forward, particularly in these current model generations, it's super hard to tell them apart. They all have a notch at this point, right? They all have glossy 5 to 7 inch screens that have no external buttons or hardware on the front. They have all moved to either in-glass fingerprint readers, facial ID, or on the back fingerprint readers, right? So basically what you're doing is using belief to ascribe technology use to a particular group of users. And it's not just phones, right? We could go through this for every technology, but I love this example because it gets people open to the concept that belief is determinative of technology design and use. So my dissertation, we don't need to talk about that. My degree is in information science. And I had to convince my faculty in information science that I wasn't just doing all soft rhetoric shit. I had to convince them that I was, in fact, a partial social scientist. So I had to operationalize belief, right? To begin to inquire into how it impacts technology design, decisions, and discourses. So I chose the probably worst possible French theorist I could have decided upon, Francois Lyotard, and his concept of libidinal economy. And I believe that doing so helps me gain insight into tensions, the visceral reactions powering both the political and economic decisions behind technology design and deployment that shape our relationship to technology. Because Lyotard argues that in every situation, institution, what artifact or whatever, reason and desire are in constant tension. That political economy's emphasis on rationality and exchange fails to capture the excesses of life that infuse, surround, power, and or sabotage those exchanges. My students are currently, well, the ones I have this summer, it's not that many, right, are currently enveloped in the idea that Apple Messages now allows people who have Android phones to participate in the affective economy of the reaction. right? Those of you who are Apple users know exactly what I'm talking about. There was a time not too long ago where if you use one of the tap back qualities on your Apple phone to signal that you liked it with the heart or thumbs up, thumbs down, or the exclamation point, the Android user would complain because they would get an entire message saying so-and-so did this particular reaction to quote the entire message, right? And this attitude of disdain, disgust, but mostly rupture has helped to shape Apple's approach to how messaging works. It now has implemented a fix, which it probably could have done all along, right, to make compatibility between these two devices, at least in terms of messaging, more convenient, smoother, right? So I think it's very important to understand that not only belief, but our discourses about how we understand ourselves can shape what technologies do. So what are the libidinal tensions we can ascribe to technoculture? Let me show you what I found by applying a technocultural lens using libidinal economy to Black technology practice. So I've been theorizing Blackness in technology, or Black technoculture. And any analysis of the West and Western technoculture must consider how modernity and capitalism are built upon and should include the libidinal economy of anti-Blackness. And I'll explain that a little bit later. The West was built on conquest, genocide, and exploitation. For example, the United States, the UK, most of Europe, right, built enormous economic and political power through the labor of non-white others. But they all reserve special circumstances, horrific ones even, for the Black, Indigenous, Asian, and South Asian men, women, and children that it forced into labor relations, right? For Black people in particular, they became objects, right? Objects of fear, of pathology, and of violence. But crucially, and because of modernity, not just capitalism, they also became technologized and informationalized. And one way in which I came to this understanding was through the first sociologist, W.E.B. Du Bois.
Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question. Unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. Instead of saying directly, "How does it feel to be a problem?" they say, "I know an excellent colored man in my town." Or, "Do not these southern outrages make your blood boil?" At these I smile, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem, I answer seldom a word. And yet being a problem is a strange experience. It dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, shut out from their world by a vast veil. For the world I longed for and all its dazzling opportunities were theirs, not mine. Why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in mine own house? It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others. One feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder.
So that particular clip illustrates a lot of the foundation of my research agenda over the last 15 years, but not necessarily in the way you think. So I mentioned earlier that my work differs from that of Ruha, of Sophia, and of Timnit, in part because I have this humanistic approach. My humanistic approach is not to understand how white people oppress us, although you may not feel that way after I finish this presentation. Instead, I'm much more interested in what Black folk do when they decide to take the reins of technology in their own hands. In other words, what's Black technoculture? Right? So Black people are constantly in the crosshairs of technical and technocultural fixes to social problems where they are the social problem. And indeed, for many institutions, e.g., for example, higher education, I can't believe I pronounced e.g., I'm such a nerd. Higher education and policing, technology is positioned as the most efficient solution to discipline long-standing social ills exemplified by Black deviants. You got cancel culture on your platform? Let's create an algorithm that does content moderation to keep those pesky, vociferous, loud Black people from irritating everybody else, right? When scholars first sought to understand information technology used by Black folk, the Black body was only legible through its perceived absence from the material, technical, and institutional aspects of computers and society. And some of you may be familiar with this construct, also known as the digital divide, right? But distributed Blackness argues instead that Black folk are natural and expert technology users, in the process casting them as Black technical subjects and agents. And to illustrate this, I turn to the first Black authored network browser, Victor Green's Negro Motorist Green Book, which also inspired the recent HBO series Lovecraft Country. And I have images of both on the slide, hopefully, right? As a traveler over America's developing automobile network infrastructure of highways, gas stations, rest stops, and leisure activities. I'm only pausing so I can make sure that we don't get disturbed by my friends and family. All right, let's do this. As such a traveler through these places, Green was deeply concerned with his own safety and navigating the context of white supremacist law, practice, and belief through which these roads wind. His vision was to provide Black travelers with a guide to locations where they could rest, refuel, or relax. The Green Book was more than a phone book or a catalog. It provided cultural metadata about a network that signaled nodes of Black life that Black motorists could avail themselves of during the journey. And what Lovecraft Country adds, I think, superlatively to Green's text and vision of a distributed Blackness is the monstrous apparition of anti-Blackness, right? Or the intersectionality of whiteness and technology. That is where politicians and newspapers proclaim that networks are erected ostensibly for freedom, democracy, and the free exchange of commerce. Whiteness also sees them as networks for alienation, domination, coercion, and even violence. And this is as true for technical networks, such as the series of tubes that we are currently running this presentation through, as well as the American highway system. I just realized you might not be able to see this slide because I forgot to modify it, but I'm going to go ahead and read that out for you. So the question I've been working towards my entire research stream is, are pathology and deviance the only motives for Black online sociality? And from there, how to understand Black digital practice as productive, life-giving online behavior, right? So to do that, I had to encumber whiteness and American society with their own practices of white supremacy, situating the technical innovation and progress with the often brutal social, cultural, and ideological context in which they began and thrived. So I'm theorizing in Distributed Blackness, a Black cultural relationship drawing upon the Black experience in the West, an experience shaped by relationships with whiteness, with our own communities, with the environment, and with technology from a social and political subject position. To get to this point, I came up with 6 qualities, 3 of which you can't see, and they are Blackness, intersectionality, invention and style, the future, modernity, and America, and asterisk. And I wanted to talk about that one that you can't see, which is American asterisk, because this is meant to signal that the United States is but one context for diasporic or worldwide Blackness, right? A Nigerian living in Britain has some shared markers of Blackness, but many different experiences thanks to the environment in which they live. For distributed Blackness, I am resolute in saying it's completely American, right? Because in many ways, America as an ideal, as an institution, as a racialized set of racialized practices is the matrix for Blackness and modernity. That is, it's well suited as a technological ideal for Black technoculture because America, the nation, created Blackness in order to survive and thrive. Toni Morrison calls this American Africanism. And American ideals inform Black community beliefs in equality, democracy, and fairness. James Baldwin found this out as an immigrant to France, where he and a number of other expats, many of whom were white, found solidarity in their Americanness as opposed to having to be understood or assimilate into French culture, right? So the rest of today's presentation will revolve around late modernity, right? From the period of colonial slavery to the Americas through today as a way to understand the informationalization of both whiteness and Blackness. And one way to do that is to take a look at take a gander at the idea of this same matrix, but from a Western technocultural perspective. So I sampled this Western technocultural matrix from an author named Joel Dinerstein. And it's characterized by 6 beliefs: progress, religion, modernity, whiteness, masculinity, and the future. One of the reasons this matrix was so attractive to me at the time I found it in 2006 is that much of the research that I've been studying, even the digital divide research, was reluctant to name race and racism or even whiteness as qualities of internet identity. It's kind of like how the Agence France-Presse or Reuters says things are racialized instead of saying they're racist. Same thing, right? In the process, I argue that by linking whiteness to technoculture, you get towards the concept that technology works to the benefit of white identity. And so what I do in distributed blackness is drill down into practice, how anti-blackness can be quantified and commodified for both capitalist profit, for technological progress, and for cultural capital, right? So one set of implicit beliefs about communication technology, especially the digital networks that we study, revolves around the idea that we all get along. The actual word is comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, but my Southern accent and lisp often render it as comedy, and so I do not have it on this slide. We believe that the internet is capable of transmitting good sociality, right? If only we regulate individual behaviors, even as we argue that the overwhelming concentration of meaning and distribution in websites and social networks leads to the spread of bad thoughts. Or have you heard anybody recently talking about misinformation and disinformation? Okay. To understand the spread of bad thought, Vincent Mosco writes that To understand how the internet can transmit good sociality around individual behaviors, Vincent Mosco writes that we desire to retain our individuality and yet participate fully in a collective community, right? Which is kind of odd as an American having witnessed the last 2 years of pandemic response, right? To understand how the websites and social networks lead to the spread of bad thought, we have long been aware that mass media technologies have been susceptible to claims of diminishing or destroying natural life, where natural typically refers to the interests of elites. But these technological myths of comity and ideology can be understood differently when race enters the picture. So in a society structured on racial subordination, whiteness is the quintessential property for personhood, right? But arguing for whiteness as only racism does a disservice to the infrastructural and institutional practices that characterize whiteness as control, right? Those of you who are deep in the history and philosophy of information science are expecting me to talk more about cybernetics. We're not gonna have that this presentation, but we can holler at it in the Q&A, right? Instead, to talk about whiteness as control, I turn to a critical race theory text, Cheryl Harris's canonical article, Whiteness as Property, because it provides nuance to white technical identity by arguing that whiteness is both an identity and a property interest. An interest which is deployable at the social, political, technical, and institutional level to maintain control, to exclude others, and for the right to use and enjoyment. And this last is most important for this presentation, as anti-blackness animates mediums and platforms where only one set of voices is valued, where only one viewpoint is honored, and where an epistemology of ignorance affords whiteness the privilege of never having to understand how racism affects others. So for the West in general, but for the United States in particular, anti-blackness and its institutional manifestation as racism is as integral to technocultural identity as are the ideals of progress, democracy, and modernity. As Lisa Nakamura wrote in 2013, racism on the internet is not a glitch, but a feature. It is foundational, if not infrastructural, to the mode, manner, and meaning of digital practice, design, and content. And while our gazes are drawn to the extremes of racism, and more recently, anti-racism or wokeness, right? The banality of racist belief manifests in everyday context, from who gets to vote to who gets to speak. So racism does not, however, require a racist, right? And so the technocultural capacity and libidinal economy of anti-blackness has been deployed throughout American history, those of you from America may be familiar with the 1619 Project, which says much the same, to construct Blackness as social death through slavery, through Jim Crow, the eugenics and phrenology, through social science, criminal law, and segregation, and I would even add through propaganda and disinformation. And these arrangements reified technoculture as how to do things to Black bodies and Blackness. Right? So race relations as an analysis of society takes for granted that race is a valid empirical datum and shifts attention from the actions that constitute racism, enslavement, disenfranchisement, redlining, lynching, massacres like the Tulsa race riots of 1923, to the traits that constitute race. For racists in the Southern United States or the New South following our Civil War, these traits might have included Negroes' ignorance, laziness, brutality, criminality, their uncontrolled passions and deviant sexuality, or their intellectual incapacity and inability to take on the intellectual duties of civilization. I wish I could claim this paragraph, but it is not mine. For scholars in our own time who accept race, once ritually purified by the incantation that race is socially constructed. As a valid category of analysis, the relevant traits of race are more likely to be difference, otherness, culture, or identity. So racist profiling gets euphemized into racial profiling. So I mentioned libidinal economy earlier. I promised I would get back to it. I wrote a song about it. Want to hear it? Here you go. So I met libidinal economy through my encounters with Afro-pessimism, particularly Frank Wilderson's Red, White, and Black. It was my introduction to libidinal economy as a way to understand what exactly it was about Black creative efforts kept getting captured and commodified by non-Black folk, or like the recent Elvis movie that just came out, right? Wilderson identifies anti-Blackness as the libidinal economy, there's that word again, of American modernity, writing that Blackness overdetermines the embodiment of impossibility, incoherence, and incapacity. So devaluation and reduction of the human body to its potential for labor is clearest when the body is Black. Now, Wilderson's Afro-pessimism rests upon the argument that Blackness is a structural position of non-communicability. I'm gonna need the philosophers in the room to explain that later, right? In the face of all other positions. So in other words, Blackness is exterior to civil society and is lived as social death. Now, social death can be understood as a denial of political, and I would add technical life in the Western Civic Project. Or for the digital divide, why do we rely on deficit models to understand how people in developing countries have yet to achieve parity in digital practices and networks without understanding the regimes of capitalism and political power and imperialism that put them in that trick bag, right? And so from this perspective of social death, everything associated with Black bodies and the Black experience becomes abjection. Right? Because if you assimilate to the hegemonic culture, you basically accepted the death that they want you to have anyway. Now, for Afro-pessimism, every context experienced by Black folk is oppression. One of my friends and I joke that for an Afro-pessimism, if all the humans were wiped out of this world, no more Black people, no more white people, they would still, Afro-pessimists would argue that the grass is still racist. Right. And I find that that particular orientation towards ontology and Blackness is unhelpful, to be polite. Right. So instead, I turn to Afro-optimism, which we can also talk about during the Q&A, but understand that anti-Blackness is a really powerful way to understand how tensions about particular bodies can drive enterprise, commerce, communication, and everything else. So my argument, at least as I start to wrap this up, right, is that anti-Blackness can be understood as modernity. Some historians and cultural theorists would call this the middle passage epistemology, right? The idea that you cannot understand modernity and racial capitalism without understanding chattel slavery. But I take it a little bit further, right? For the arts and society writ large, anti-Blackness is a non-communicable structural position in society, one that is incapable of being alienated, because alienation is a quality of the human. Or for those of you who follow TikTok from a couple of years ago, the idea that the creator of the Renegade dance, Jalea Harmon, somehow became less popular, even though she created the dance and was damn good at it, than the young white women who kind of sort of half-ass performed it, yet were invited to participate in global events such as the NBA All-Star Game to perform, or the Jimmy Kimmel Show to perform their sad interpretations of her dance, right? Jalea Harmon's small Black body was understood as not being human enough to be compensated for the actions that she did. Now, because I mentioned TikTok, I want to talk about modernity and technoculture briefly. And for modernity and technoculture, the way that I argue for anti-blackness as modernity is that data and processes are erected, deployed, and maintained, rarely ever destroyed, right? That ostensibly prove that communities living outside of normalcy are verifiably outside of normalcy using quantification, data, and computational processes for either profit or governmentality. This slide is a lot. Mark it on your count, mark it on your notes. We can come back and talk to it. And so the linkage for me between anti-blackness, Afro-pessimism, and modernity is arguing for blackness as a Black technical object. And in the not so recent past, we can see aspects of whiteness as an avatar of control and racism in action. So John Locke, the writer on civic freedom and human liberty, also just so happened to own slaves and invest in Caribbean slave plantations that produce rum, right? There's no conflict between these two. Right? No more so than Mitch McConnell. I'm sorry, this is going to be overly American. My bad. I'm sure the Australian former Premier Morrison has some dirt in his past, but I know the American side. So no more so than Mitch McConnell, the senator from Kentucky and the Senate Majority Leader, suddenly having his fortune balloon by 20 some odd $1 million thanks to his investments in Russian companies that built corporations and industries in his state. Right? There's no conflict. Enlightenment discourse promoted that slavery at the time was progressive and development for both parties, right? That they somehow helped Black people by removing them from their homes and bringing them to civilization, and in the process, enriching a few white people along the way, right? So this justifies the civilization of African slaves, indigenous slaves, Asians and South Asians as indentured labor, while celebrating entrepreneurship based on the natural exploitation of labor. So from this, I argue that modernity in the West should be understood as information control and use, and as such has always been anti-Black. And while I could turn to my present day example of Amazon's use of algorithms and computations to control, hire, and fire its warehouse workers, right? I instead prefer to reach back to their predecessor, the slave plantation. Caitlin Rosenthal, in the book Accounting for Slavery, writes that the ideal plantation was a model of efficiency because its premise was Black inferiority as an engine for capitalistic profit. Now, while plantations have typically been considered as pre-modern enterprises, their complex labor structures, accounting practices, invention of managerial techniques such as scientific productivity, and infusions of venture capital, right, from investors and planters rather than the state, marked them as clearly modern. Slaves were valued alongside livestock as economic commodities, helping to obscure their humanity and reinforcing the commonly expressed view of planters and politicians that slavery was essentially about business, not exploitation. Right? And this investment by these absentee landlords and investors would have been impossible without a regular flow of data from their Caribbean managers and agents. Because slavery capitalism quantified enslaved people. It cataloged them based on how long they lived. It classified them based on what types of work they felt they did, from children as young as 8 to elders, right? And measuring them according to these traits of age, gender, beauty, for reproductive purposes, of course, skin color, strength, and attitude, right? And these data practices reduced people to commodities and data, and they were traded as such. Right. So anti-Blackness then underpins the creation of our modern appetite for data, because it's hard for me not to extrapolate this particular understanding of the plantation where workers actually pick cotton to Amazon's designation of the activities of its workers as having to pick a certain number of items per hour in order to maintain their jobs, right? So it underpins the creation of modern appetite for data, for managerial identity, and the commodification of Blackness. So let's recap. Technologies can be understood as a three-part construct. From this perspective, we can evaluate something like an algorithm or a large language model, or whatever your particular flavor of extreme computation is, as an artifact, as a practice or set of practices. But crucially, algorithms operate as an enactment of beliefs and discourses about the world. As technologists, we prefer to argue that our work proceeds from first principles of materiality, techne, or skill and expertise, but instead, any technical endeavor should properly begin by reflecting upon sociological and cultural understandings of that technology's use and consequences. So the functionalities of these algorithms by design, or Lambda AI, right, appear and engage a friendly level of human perception. The level of abstraction, the functionalities of code, the relations of code and hardware, and human semantics, and the temporalities of computational and internet transmission do not appear, do not engage, nor operate at friendly or any conscious level of human perception. Right, and this is from an essay by Jamie Sky Bianco called Algorithm. You can find it in Rosa Bradati's edited collection, Post-Human Glossary. So then I have to move to algorithmic technoculture. Right. So modernity's capacity to extract and exploit is directly linked to slavery's technologization of Black bodies and white managerial supremacy. Right? Or, as Fred Moten argues in the case of Blackness, the cultural and political discourse on Black pathology has been so pervasive that it could be said to constitute the background against which all representations of Blackness, or even the color Black take place. Right? So racism helped to constitute and are crucial to modern state making. States become modern. Silicon Valley corporations get infusions of venture capital, right? Because they're drawn into the modern world order by conceiving and being conceived in racial terms. And it's also increasingly the case that to remain modern and to exercise power in the current world order, states must innovate new ways to police boundaries, right? So Ruha Benjamin contends that visions of development and progress are too often built upon forms of social and political subjugation that require upgrading in the form of novel techniques of classification and control. Right. When scholars set out to study the values, assumptions, and desires that shape science and technology, we must also remain attentive to the racial anxieties and fears that shape the design of technoscience. The era of big data, for example, is intertwined with the fabrication of big deviance. Right? But my question for you educators and professors in the audience is, at what point do your students get enough time to take on these advanced sociological and cultural theories about how technology shaped the world? We can talk about that later too. Right? In contemporary times, this anti-blackness, this algorithmic technoculture can be seen in the rise of algorithmic models and practices designed to make once governmental concerns more efficient, right? Further reducing and restricting resources intended to aid those already suffering under these information regimes. Ruben Amaro noted that what we experience today as algorithmic prejudice is simply the materialization of an overriding logic of correlation and hierarchy hidden under the illusion of objectivity. Meanwhile, the fictive substances of race and racialization work to disrupt self-actualization by reinforcing the false assumption of coherence. Or your model seems to predict a world that is logical, true, and relevant, even as the conditions under which it was produced and the data upon which it's trained are deeply steeped in the prejudices that are already pre-existing its creation. So how did I get here, right? because I talked a lot of shit for the last few slides, a lot of theoretical shit, right? And I got here in a way that I hadn't anticipated. My work, because it focuses on Black agency, has been fairly criticized because I don't examine racism enough. Because one of my arguments for my book is that racism is not the only thing that defines me as a Black person. But in order to get tenure, I decided to be more thorough in my investigations, and I decided to examine Black folks' discourses about mundane online racism. And by mundane, I don't mean that they just saw somebody stub their toe and somebody like, oh, nigga, like they didn't say that, right? It's more where videos of unarmed Black men and women being murdered by police were shared and reshared to their online spaces. And I call these videos mundane because they depict the condition in which Blackness already exists, that is the ongoing, enduring influence of anti-Blackness on policing. But they're also mundane because they're shared as colorblind content. It's not like some individual white person said, let me upload this video so I can traumatize these Black folk. The algorithm, the content policies of the particular service, and the ways in which we have transformed ourselves into an engagement and attention economy all work together to traumatize Black folk. And so because Black folk tend to see and share content about race more than any other demographic, these videos quickly dominated their algorithmically constructed timelines and feeds. They achieve immense visibility through a dumpster fire, conflagration, right, of algorithmic publication, drawing energy from patterns of online practices, voracious social media seeking engagement, social media feeds, seeking engagement, and libertarian beliefs that all individuals should be able to express opinions without fear of censorship, enacted through code, policy, and moderation. So in effect, these folk are experiencing racism without racists, right? Some folk came up with a technical fix, an ad hoc technical fix, which was basically shouting at other people, don't share this video, right? But I wanted to think past that type of instrumental solution. So libidinal economy affords me the capacity to theorize Black encounters with online racism beyond the words, actions, and posts themselves, beyond productivity or commodification, right? There are underlying tensions that also contribute to the content you see online, right? And these frames in turn contribute to digital practices such as sociality, engagement, virality, content production, and identity formation. So while the practice of online racism has received enormous attention, thanks to the work of Sophia, Ruha, and others, the effects of online racism on Black folk have not been as thoroughly researched. In Distributed Blackness, I argue that online racism not only hurts and offends, it also implicitly and explicitly compels this condition I call interiority, Black interiority, right? Through repeated exposures, through white information behaviors such as content moderation policies, unfair content moderation policies, and algorithmic publishing. And for those of you who may be wondering what I mean by interiority, if you've ever been microaggressed, right? If somebody has said something slick to you and you couldn't figure out whether you were being insulted or complimented, and so you either had to take a moment to think to yourself, was that racist? Or you had to ask a friend, was that racist? That's a moment of interiority because you're stopping to reflect, examine your interior environment, your cognition, your intellect, your spirit, right? Your emotions to say, am I reacting to something that was real or am I just paranoid? Right? So online racism, so while the explicit is egregious, right? In one article I found that in the introduction of a Black browser to a space called TechCrunch, which was for a time one of the most popular blogs covering Silicon Valley and technology innovation, right? This blog decided to cover the launch of a browser called Blackbird, which was designed by Black people for Black people. And one of the first comments was 3 pages of the word nigger just printed out over and over and over again until it took up 3 pages. Those of you who are old enough to remember Java Chat, Yahoo Chat, MSN alike, remember that people used to do the same thing. They would spam the entire chat room by putting so much stuff up on the screen that you couldn't actually participate in it until all that stuff had scrolled up. This is a similar thing, right? And you wouldn't think, or maybe you know better than I do, right, that such a civil, technically skilled place would also harbor people that would do that type of behavior. Trust me, I was shocked as well, right? Now, the researcher William Smith calls the impact of implicit racism, right? So not the repeated assertion, the repeated calls of the N word, right? But instead microaggressions, right? He calls the impact of those on Black people as racial battle fatigue, right? And I argue in Distributed Blackness that also compels Black interiority, right? Thanks to, say, the repeated introduction, sharing, and reposting of images of Black death at the hands of the state in your algorithmic social media feed. Now, I mentioned earlier that Pew Internet found that Black folk experience racialized online content. I felt I should probably put up a slide that looks like I got it from Pew Internet. And here you can see their findings. This is from maybe 5 years ago, and I think they've updated it. The percentages haven't changed, but just something to illustrate just how much engagement Black folk have with content that is raced or racialized. And so from this, I'm comfortable in arguing that race and racism determines the type of information delivered to Black folk, the type of information they post, and their interactions with that content. So we're back to the libidinal algorithm, right? In experiencing racism, Black folk must evaluate the ontology and the epistemology, the what and the why, of white supremacy, as well as how it affects them, right? In online spaces, racial battle fatigue, or from a technical term, networked libidinal intentions, arise from the diffusion of racist and racialized content through social media practice, connectivity, and publishing, right? And I call this phenomenon weak tie racism, where racism manifests through digital and online media's affordances for sharing information, including but not limited to algorithmically published and shared and distributed social media content. These microaggressions have no author. They're not individually performative, but instead the algorithm serves them up as a composite of capitalist, developer, and network beliefs. We could even talk about the ways in which your country regulates the type of images that can be produced, right, in online spaces, right? About online sociality, leading to microaggressions at scale, or an anti-blackness as an effect on Black digital practice. Almost done, y'all. I know I kept y'all for a long time, right? So I came to weak tie racism because I'm still half a sociologist / social scientist, right? And part of that sociology outlook is the work of Mark Granovetter, right? Those of you who do social network analysis or any kind of information science should be intimately familiar, right? And so for weak tie racism, the social media algorithm's libidinal intensity is revealed, right? Just as weak ties are meant to describe social relationships between people who are not intimates, that have perhaps peripheral relationship, not a strong one such as kinship or proximity, right? I argue that the algorithm also has a weak tie relationship between content and node, right? Demanding as it does its own interaction and reciprocity to sustain the relationship between user and network. This weak tie racism manifests through affordances for injudiciously sharing information that is injudicious until the profit motive and white technical identity is considered. Right? Now, we know that microaggressions can be environmental, a characterization that explains to some extent the virtual spaces in which weak tie racism is encountered. It harms through accretion. Right? The text is only experienced in an activity of a production. If you see a video of George Floyd with 7 likes, and then that video re-enters your feed, but it now has 47,000 likes, right? This is a slow accretion of violence, right? An activity of production that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time or space, and most crucially, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. So weak tie racism then is a computational manifestation of microaggressions. When one sees a racist tweet receive hundreds of thousands of interactions, is the platform the antagonist? Some folk might say yes. Do the platform's features and affordances of sociality, likes, shares to friends, or techno-social comedy make my cousin's retweet to my family a racist interaction? Now, we know the art of liking a video can be influenced by the already present signifiers of virality, but it's correctly not assumed to be in and of itself a racist act. Yet its contribution to virality can be understood in the aggregate as weak tie racism. I'm gonna skip a slide so we can get to the end. So how would it reshape our understanding of the internet if we acknowledge that racism and misogyny, which is a totally different presentation, right, shapes the design of mundane technologies such as algorithms and other computational models? Now, racism for the West provides an emotional intensity, pleasure, right, and intimacy. If, as has been noted elsewhere, that Americans have historically shared media, designed financial practices, or otherwise operated from a belief about the subhumanity of Black folk, why would the internet be any different? The internet, as an infrastructural implementation of weak-tied communication, is capable of racism without racists, given its capacity to share information framed by the epistemological ignorance of the men, mostly men, who have designed its tools and protocols. Or are you worried that Elon is about to take over Twitter? Now, I'm wary of technical solutions to online harms or even incorporating ethics as a fix for the problems of technoculture. Doctors have a code of ethics to do no harm, yet Black women in the United States routinely experience the highest rates of childbirth mortality. That's not something ethics can address, because ethics is meant as a code of professional conduct or a way to alleviate institutional risk. Perhaps instead, we should be talking about a moral code of harm reduction when deploying complex algorithmic solutions to even more complex social problems. Now, in recent talks, I used the phrase no non-innocent infrastructures to argue that technologies, such as algorithms, are always designed, deployed, and experienced within cultural contexts. For example, large language models are often trained on data sets representing less than 10% of the languages used worldwide. And in the process, white supremacists and misogynists, ageist, etc. views are overrepresented in the training data, not only exceeding their prevalence in the general population, but also setting up models trained on those data sets to further amplify biases and harms. Or that Amazon recently introduced a necropolitical stochastic parrot, an Alexa feature that can sample a user's voice data within less than a minute to, for example, recreate the words of a recently deceased loved one. Does Alexa understand the effects of that speech on a listener, or is it just parroting words it has ingested for capitalist gains and necropolitical affect? Instead, a possible alternative mode of algorithmic design could draw upon a practice of harm reduction. Roger Cooks and his colleagues argue that we should decenter putative social goods, or comity, as a rationale for fixing algorithmic culture. Right? Instead, they argue for the centrality of harm rather than a putative social good, because harm is multivalent. It directs attention to collective and individual injury and to responses to threat and wrongdoing. It can be the sacrifice of one human need to serve another equally vital one, like getting vaccinated, right? A demand that we surrender autonomy in exchange for public health. This analysis that I presented to you today draws from my analysis of harms experienced by Black digital practitioners, rather than an inquiry into the utopian possibilities of information access and democracy. Powerful systems distribute harm to differently valued bodies according to known historical trajectories of violence, exploitation, and profit. We are always already enmeshed in non-infrastructures. Digital traces of people are in no way equivalent to people themselves. So while humans made the strategic decisions to do so, it is your computational innovation that can be responsible for the tactical placement of videos of state-sanctioned murder of unarmed Black and brown folk. Should we absolve the machine of any responsibility in the distribution of its information? I ask instead to consider this approach, which is one way to understand the computer's role in the ways in which information is shared and distributed online. Thank you.
Please feel free to do so. And do we have some virtual questions as well? Sorry, we're getting the mics set up.
Thank y'all for sticking with me. I know we started late and I ran long, so I appreciate you hanging out to ask questions. Or just not approvingly. I appreciate that too.
Please feel free to go ahead.
Hi, Michele Loi, Politecnico di Milano.
I'm Italian, and so of course that means that also I've never studied in the United States, so my understanding of the race issue in the U.S. context is extremely limited. Now, we did this disclaimer. I'm just going to go for the more abstract philosophical issues, starting with your last analogy of for the vaccination, or let's say the masks thing. So you're saying we can relinquish some degree of autonomy for the sake of public health, where of course the strength of that argument is that we're actually thinking of public health in terms of harm reduction. And also, I mean, the most celebrated principle of liberalism is John Stuart Mill harm principle. And again, the emphasis there is on harm rather than the promotion of good. However, just following this example of this analogy, we also know that in the case of, say, COVID, for instance, if you take your goal to be the elimination of all harm, in a sense, you can be quite extreme in the degree of to which you limit people's autonomy. So think about, for instance, the way in which China is currently dealing with COVID, which, I don't know, I mean, I would say it's at least a matter of open discussion whether we want to do it the way they're doing, where basically they're still restricting individual freedoms to a degree that in Europe and in the US is kind of unthinkable, pursuing that policy of still, instead of trying to live with COVID, really trying to make contagion very improbable. So, but the analogy will be that the issue doesn't really seem to be that we have this sort of absolute principle to avoid harm, which can justify the limitation of autonomy. But it's always a political issue. How do we balance these two things? And so I wanted to ask you, what do you have to say about that? How in the algorithmic world can we achieve a definition of that balance between how much we want to restrict autonomy for the sake of avoiding harm, which takes into due consideration the stakes of all people involved, especially of both the people in position of greater power and the people in position of less power. Thank you.
It's a fantastic question and a tough scenario to try to address. So I will say, and I am not a physician or anything, I'm just a nerd who likes to look at data. From my understanding, Western countries have experienced much more in terms of death, infection, and sickness with respect to COVID than Asian countries. I was actually curious as to what the protocols around masking and the like are there in Korea, because I understand that South Korea has a much lower incidence of death than most Western countries, individually or combined, right? The answer to your question for me, particularly understanding from the context of liberalism, John Stuart Mill wrote as a Scotsman those principles of liberalism at the same time that slavery was going on in English colonial possessions across the water, right? And so those principles of liberalism did not apply to the Black bodies that were incorporated in the system of chattel slavery. What I take from that is that when you were talking about public health, and in particular, the idea that there should be a common understanding of sacrifice in order to maintain a certain level of health for someone, it's not so much that I want to go to the extreme that everybody must be vaccinated, but I want to go to the principle that at some point, humans have to give up their individual sovereignty in order to ensure the survival of the collective, right? And I go there because if I wanted to redirect that back to algorithms, using Tim Neat's research, where she looked at how certain models only use like less than 10% of the world's languages in order to produce quote unquote large language models, right? What policies of exception in the name of technical sovereignty are being used in these algorithmic models that elide or hide right, other populations with that will actually end up being more directly affected by the problematics of these algorithms. So yes, from a liberal perspective, it's enticing to understand, it's enticing to argue that at some point individualism should be allowed to have some pushback against the carceral collectivity of, say, public health, right, or harm reduction. But in a real world context, when you implement that type of governmental practice, it's always the least among us who get harmed the most. That part is the part that I'm most interested in, right? I want to be sure that even if all the white people are healthy, I also want all the Black people, the essential workers, the brown people, right, the poorest among us. I want them to be healthy as well, right? And that's something that I try to continue to maintain across all of my work. Hopefully that kind of sort of answer your question.
Thanks, Andre. And do we have a very quick question from the virtual audience?
Yeah, I think we can go a little bit longer as well to let the other person standing up have a question too. So there's a lot in the Q&A, Andre, and I think it would be great if you don't mind sort of jumping on there after we wrap the live portion. So I've got to pick one out of these four. I mean, I think that there's a kind of a fairly there's a common thread in terms of Robert's question and Chiara's question, and to a certain degree Christina's as well, in terms of kind of what the actual steps are. I think this continues in a way from Michele's question just now. Like, what are the next steps? If you're not going to go for a professional code of ethics, if you're going to apply harm reduction, like, what is there really that one can do? I mean, Robert points out that all of these things are interlinked with, you know, to put it all together, imperialist, white supremacist, heteropatriarchy. So is this a council of despair in a way, that the only thing you can do is overthrow everything? What are the steps that might be kind of feasible to take in the world that we are likely to live in for the next 10 to 15 years, especially you guys in America? I mean, you know, in terms of public health and sort of being able to deal with these systems responsibly, there are countries that are better models for how to govern responsibly, even if everyone has their own pathology.
Absolutely. So one of the things I used to keep in this presentation, but I took out, was that the idea that there are certain things that are problematic rather than problems, right? Racism is a problematic. We will not solve racism anytime soon. We will not solve misogyny or transphobia anytime soon, because it's not a problem to be solved. Instead, what we can understand that particular phenomena is as a problematic, meaning it behooves us to mount inquiries into why those things happen, so that we can at least begin to understand the contours of the problematic and begin to implement solutions, right? So I always am afraid to say I ain't got no solution, right? But what I would like to see are elements, say, I threw this comment in the middle of the presentation, elements where STEM students can actually take ethics, history, cultural theory, literature courses, in addition to the technical demands that y'all place upon them, so that they can get the good jobs, right? Or do the complicated research, so that they can understand the cultural consequences. This is a mode of empathy, right? Not sympathy. I don't want y'all to feel sorry for me because I'm Black, because let me tell you, I enjoy being Black. It's fucking fantastic, right? But the ways in which my Blackness intersects with the world, I feel like it could use some fixing, right? And one of the ways to do that is to overcome epistemologies of ignorance, right? Or deliberate misunderstandings of the possibilities of race and racism, right? By addressing them through education, through interaction, right? And other modes, including technical fixes, right? Such as opening up content moderation policies to be more transparent, right? Or making sure your the data that you're training models on is not hyper focused on a particular segment, right, of a particular population, and not able to discern where there's misinformation, racism, and the like in there, and just assume that that's data, as opposed to understanding that it is something that is abhorrent to the collectivity, the future collectivity and health of that group. Long answer, I apologize. But so there's no clear solution, but there are steps that can be taken to alleviate some of the harms.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. And then our final in-person question.
Hi. Thank you so much, Andre, for that brilliant talk. I am still thinking through it, and it's a lot to work through. So I'm a graduate student in sociology. I'm going to try to make this question not overly nerdy, but I love the way that you brought in this idea of weak ties. And to segue from the preceding question too, I'm really interested in how we understand harm on the internet. And I've been thinking about the idea of complex contagions. So for the audience, a complex contagion, in contrast to a weak tie, is a piece of information or kind of an understanding that you need usually multiple signals to understand. It's a complex idea. You need interaction, usually from multiple individuals, to get to the spread of a complex contagion. So you have this idea of weak ties, and you demonstrate, I think, brilliantly how racism uses weak ties to propagate on the internet. What I'm interested in understanding is to understand harm, to understand the harm that we impose on Black bodies as a society. Is that something that you view as a complex contagion? What does it take for us as a society to understand this idea of harm and how it's perpetuated?
It's a great question. I'm not familiar with this particular concept that you mentioned, but I can offer something, right? My vague remembrance of Shannon and Weaver with their communication model was a sender and a receiver and a beam between the two of them that represented the signal that was being transferred. And anything that wasn't directly in the beam was considered noise, right? And that model dominated telecommunications for a very long time. I'm not technical enough to say whether people have decided to finally walk away from it, but it's super instructive for me, right? Because technologists often believe that the best way to communicate between sender and receiver is to send information with as little loss of information as possible. Send a signal with a little loss of information as possible. But that in many ways neglects the environment in which the receiver operates, the environment in which the sender operates, and the environment through which the message is decoded and uncoded by either machines that are picking it up or people who may happen to be privy to that message as it moves through the network, right? So for a complex contagion, it's really fascinating to me because as someone who's using libidinal economy to try to understand information use, my question to you would be, what are the factors behind the affections and desires that are made manifest in this complex contagion? So while you were talking, I said out loud, QAnon, right? And QAnon is fascinating to me, especially its global reach, because it's absolutely, I apologize to any QAnon adherents in the room. It's a batshit crazy way of trying to understand, right? A batshit crazy way of trying to understand governance, democracy, and civilization, right? To the point where they're calling people groomers and saying that if you're a liberal thinker, you're absolutely trying to convince parents to raise their children in ways that expose them to sexual predation, right? But there are libidinal tensions behind that, right? There are fears about the loss of whiteness as an elite status, of masculinity as an elite status, as women losing their role as the special protected class of white men, and so that their actions and activities in the service of civilization or whiteness can also be protected, right? And so when you start to understand it from that level, the complex contagion becomes a little less complex, right? The inputs may be super varied, the recipients may be wildly disparate, right? The idea that in the United States, many of the people who participate in insurrection are non-white, right? People are like, well, how is that possible? This is about white supremacy. And I'm like, you have no idea how attractive white supremacy is to people who have no power, right? And so understanding these tensions, I hate to use the word, these affects, right? And the ways in which they influence information uptake and behavior, particularly across weak ties, right? I think is some possibility that may be super fruitful for the type of research that you're doing. I ain't saying I can tell you how to do it, but it's something to consider as you continue trying to unpack why it's so complex, but still so easily transmissible across people who otherwise seem to have nothing in common. How's that?
Thank you. Thank you. More to think with.
Okay. Email me if you want me to try to explain that, because I'm on the clock here. I got to talk fast. So if you want more, if you want to discuss more, feel free to email me.
Okay, will do.
Please join me again in thanking André so much for his excellent presentation. And thanks to everyone so much for joining us. Oh, Andre, sorry, go ahead.
Before y'all kick me off the stream, to ask Seth to tell me how I can look at the other Q&A questions once I get off. You can do that afterwards, but I just want to be sure to say it before I lost everything.
Definitely, yeah, we'll still have you over here. No worries. But thanks, everyone, and feel free to enjoy your break, and we'll be back soon for the next session.
Sorry, just so that's. I think we have a really busy day today, so we're going to have to try and actually get back in for 9:30. So let's try and get back on schedule for the rest of the day. Andre, if you can hear me, mate, if you go to the right-hand side, you'll see the chat and the Q&A. Ha, there you are. Thanks, mate. That was fantastic.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Thanks, Andre. It's Charles. Well done.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Right side of the chat. Q&A. Got it. All right. I have to go back to my writing group. All right. It's been a pleasure, you guys. Charles and Seth, thank you for inviting me. I hope this was helpful or interesting. And I'll talk to y'all again soon.
Yeah, man. You can check back on this link later on, and people will still be, the chat is persistent. So when you have a moment, you can pop back and answer the questions, and people will be able to see it then. All right.
All right.
Enjoy your workshop, mate. Bye.
Okay.